The grand lecture hall at NYU Stern was buzzing with energy. Students filled the seats, notebooks and laptops open, eager for another class with Professor Jonathan Harrington. He wasn't just any professor, he was a legend in the field of economics. A former Wall Street analyst, best-selling author and relentless intellectual, he was known for his razor-sharp critiques and an ego that rivaled the Manhattan skyline. That morning, as students settled in, Harrington adjusted his suit, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room. He smirked, knowing today's lecture would be unforgettable. "This generation," he declared, pacing at the front of the class, "has been handed everything. You believe success is your birthright, that your last name alone should grant you power. But let me remind you, legacy means nothing in my class." His gaze lingered for a moment on a particular student in the back row. A tall, young man with sharp features and an unmistakable resemblance to someone the world knew well. Barron Trump. Despite his towering height and calm demeanor, Barron rarely spoke in class. Some students whispered about him, others watched in awe. Was he just another privileged kid, riding on his father's name? Or was there something more to him? Harrington saw an opportunity. He thrived on dismantling egos, and today he had a target. "Mr. Trump," the professor called out. Barron lifted his head, locking eyes with Harrington. The room fell silent. "You've been awfully quiet this semester," Harrington continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I assume you're absorbing my lectures like the rest of your classmates? Or do you think your name exempts you from serious academic discussion?" A murmur spread through the students. Some smirked, sensing trouble. Others shifted uncomfortably. Barron leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "I listen," he replied coolly. "I just don't speak unless I have something meaningful to say." Harrington chuckled. "Meaningful? Well then, let's put your mind to the test." He turned to the whiteboard and scribbled a complex economic scenario involving global trade, inflation, and currency devaluation. "Since your father built an empire, surely you understand the basics of international markets?" Harrington taunted. "Solve this problem, and maybe I'll believe you belong here." The students gasped. A direct challenge. Public test. Barron studied the board for a moment. Then, without hesitation, he rose from his seat. His slow, deliberate steps toward the front of the room created an almost cinematic tension. He picked up the marker, scanned the problem once more, and with a confident smirk of his own, started writing. The lecture hall was silent, save for the rhythmic squeak of the marker against the whiteboard. Barron Trump, the son of the sitting president of the United States, stood before the class, calmly working through Professor Harrington's economic problem. Harrington crossed his arms, leaning slightly against his desk, watching Barron with a mixture of skepticism and amusement. He had humiliated countless students in his career. Some had stumbled, others had cracked under the pressure. But this was different. Barron wasn't rushing. He wasn't flustered. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. As he wrote, students leaned in, watching in fascination. Some recorded the moment on their phones, sensing something extraordinary was happening. When Barron finally put the cap back on the marker, he turned to the professor. "That should do it," he said, stepping aside. Harrington walked to the board, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Barron's solution. The classroom waited, breathless. Then came the unexpected. Harrington's smirk faltered. His fingers tapped against his chin as he traced through the logic, realizing begrudgingly that Barron had not only solved the problem but had done so in a way that was both elegant and unconventional. It was the kind of answer only someone with an advanced understanding of economics would dare to attempt. A hushed murmur spread through the room. Harrington turned back to Barron. "Interesting approach," he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Barron met his gaze. "I figured the standard method would be too predictable. You seem like the kind of professor who appreciates creative solutions." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps irritation, crossed Harrington's face. He was not used to being outmaneuvered, certainly not by a student, and definitely not by someone whose last name had been a punchline in academia. But instead of conceding, he smirked again, regaining his composure. Clever. But let's see how you handle a real challenge. He walked back to his desk, grabbing a stack of papers. Since you seem to have a knack for economics, how about a debate? Barron raised an eyebrow. I propose a public discussion right here next week, Harrington announced, turning to the class. The topic, the future of American capitalism. Should we reform it? You and I will go head to head. Gasps erupted from the students. A direct intellectual duel between one of the country's most renowned economists and the president's son? This was going to be legendary. Barron didn't hesitate. All right, he said, his voice calm. I'm in. Harrington grinned, but there was something predatory in it. He had spent decades debating on national television, dismantling arguments with surgical precision. He had no doubt that, by the end of this, Barron Trump would be just another student who had learned a harsh lesson. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media exploded with the announcement. NYU Stern professor challenges Barron Trump to a live debate. Political commentators, economic analysts, and the general public were all weighing in. Some saw it as a bold academic challenge. Others called it an unfair setup, a seasoned economist versus a 19-year-old college student. As the day of the debate approached, the NYU auditorium filled beyond capacity. Cameras from major news networks lined the back of the hall. The event was being live-streamed, with millions of Americans tuning in. Professor Jonathan Harrington arrived in a tailored suit, exuding confidence. He shook hands with the event moderator, then glanced at Barron, who sat across from him at the long, polished debate table. Barron Trump, dressed in a sharp navy blazer, looked calm and composed. Unlike his father's bombastic style, Barron was known for his quiet demeanor. But tonight he had to prove himself. The moderator cleared his throat. Welcome, everyone, to this special event at NYU Stern. Tonight's topic, the future of American capitalism. Should we reform it? On one side, we have Professor Jonathan Harrington, esteemed economist and author. And on the other, Barron Trump, NYU student and, of course, the son of the sitting president of the United States. A mix of applause and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Professor Harrington, you may begin. Harrington leaned forward. Ladies and gentlemen, capitalism, true capitalism, is what made America great. But today we face a crisis. Rising inequality, unchecked corporate power, and the concentration of wealth among the elite threaten the foundation of our economy. He gestured toward Barron. Some would argue that we must double down on free market policies, that we must let corporations dictate the economy without regulation. But history tells us otherwise. We need reform, wealth redistribution, taxation, and government intervention to ensure economic stability. Otherwise, we are heading toward collapse. The audience clapped. Harrington leaned back, a smug smile on his face. His opening was strong. Now it was Barron's turn. Barron adjusted the microphone. Professor Harrington raises good points, he said. But let's be clear, his argument isn't about saving capitalism. It's about changing it into something unrecognizable. A few eyebrows raised. Barron continued. Every time an economy struggles, the solution proposed by intellectuals is the same. More government control. But history shows us that when the government intervenes too much, we get inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation. He glanced at Harrington. You talk about inequality. But let's be honest, has regulation actually stopped the ultra-wealthy from getting richer? No. It's the middle class that suffers under excessive policies. We don't need bigger government. We need smarter capitalism. One that promotes competition, innovation, and financial literacy. The crowd erupted. Even some of the students who had doubted Barron were nodding in agreement. Harrington's smirk twitched. This wasn't going to be as easy as he had thought. Professor Harrington straightened his tie, suppressing the irritation creeping up his spine. He had expected Barron to fumble, to stutter through generic free market talking points. Instead, the young man had delivered a poised, compelling argument. One that resonated with the crowd. But Harrington wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Leaning forward, he clasped his hands together. Mr. Trump, your words sound impressive, but let's not forget who benefits the most from deregulation. The wealthiest 1%. Let's talk about your own family. The Trump organization thrived because of tax loopholes, government bailouts, and questionable financial tactics. A few audience members chuckled. Harrington smirked. Would you call that smart capitalism, or just privilege protecting itself? A hush fell over the auditorium. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the personal attack. Barron didn't flinch. He let the tension settle before calmly responding. I was wondering when you'd bring up my last name, he said. It's predictable. When people can't win an argument on ideas, they go after the person instead. A few murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Barron continued. My father's business practices aren't the topic of this debate. But since you brought it up, yes, my family has benefited from capitalism. But so have millions of others who worked their way up through innovation, investment, and risk-taking. He leaned slightly forward, mirroring Harrington's posture. The irony is, you're sitting here criticizing capitalism while teaching at a university that charges $80,000 a year. Do you donate your salary to wealth redistribution? Do you refuse your book royalties? The audience gasped. Some laughed. Harrington's jaw tensed. Barron didn't stop. Here's the truth. The market isn't perfect, but neither is government intervention. Every time we've expanded federal control, whether it's banking regulations, healthcare, or taxation, we've seen unintended consequences that hurt the very people we're trying to help. He gestured toward the students. You all are taking out massive student loans because of government-backed tuition hikes. Small businesses are struggling because of high taxes and unnecessary regulations. And yet, Professor Harrington wants more of that? That's not reform. That's economic suffocation. The audience erupted into applause. Even some of Harrington's usual supporters looked intrigued. Harrington forced a smile. A well-rehearsed speech, Mr. Trump. But you're ignoring the reality. I'm addressing reality, Barron interrupted, his voice unwavering. You just don't like that it doesn't fit your narrative. For the first time that evening, Harrington had no immediate comeback. And just like that, the balance of power in the debate had shifted. The auditorium was electric. Barron Trump had just flipped the script on one of the most respected professors in the country, and even Harrington's most loyal students were struggling to deny it. Professor Harrington, however, wasn't about to concede. He straightened his papers, taking a deep breath. His reputation was on the line, and he had one last move to make. All right, he said, forcing a smirk. You're articulate, I'll give you that. But let's test how much you really understand. He grabbed a marker and scribbled a rapid equation on the whiteboard. A complex economic model, filled with supply-side variables, tax multipliers, and fiscal impact projections. Since you claim government intervention is the problem, Harrington said, stepping aside, explain how cutting corporate taxes increases GDP growth in a way that offsets lost federal revenue. Show me your math. A few students chuckled. This was it. No more rhetoric, no more philosophical debates. Just cold, hard numbers. Barron stood up and walked calmly to the board. The crowd held its breath. Then, something no one expected happened. Instead of writing anything, Barron turned back to the audience and said, "This is why academia fails to prepare students for the real world." The room went silent. Economics isn't just about formulas. It's about human behavior. People don't make decisions based on equations alone. They react to incentives, market conditions, and policy expectations. If you overtax corporations, they don't just absorb the cost. They pass it down through layoffs, price increases, or offshoring. He turned to the board and circled the equation. These numbers assume static conditions, but economies are dynamic. Capital moves. People innovate. That's why tax cuts, when done right, stimulate investment and economic expansion that can offset revenue losses over time. A thunderous applause erupted. Even some of Harrington's most devoted followers were nodding. Harrington's face went pale. He had thrown down the ultimate academic challenge, and Barron had countered it with something even stronger, real-world logic. The professor swallowed his pride. With a slow nod, he said into the mic, "Well argued." And just like that, the debate was over. But what shocked everyone even more was what happened next. The clip of Barron's closing argument went viral. Political commentators from both the left and right dissected it for weeks. Major CEOs, investors, and even economists praised his insights. And then, 3 days later, Barron Trump received an unexpected email. It was from a top investment firm on Wall Street. "We were very impressed with your debate at NYU. Would you be interested in an internship?" Professor Harrington had tried to embarrass Barron. Instead, he had set him up for a career-defining moment. And as Barron read the email, a small, knowing smile crossed his face. Sometimes the best way to win isn't by playing their game. It's by changing the game entirely.